the BBC's found that billions of pounds worth of green energy projects are on hold because there's no point in them, because they can't plug into the UK's electricity system. So they can renewably, if that's the right word, renewably generate the electricity, but can't plug into the system because of the limits of the system. Some projects have been told they'll have to wait up to 15 years to connect to the national grid. Sounds barking mad. Professor Keith Bell is co-director of the UK Energy Research Centre. Thanks very much for joining us, Professor Bell. So the national grid is what then? Just take us back to the start on this.
So the electricity system is interconnected across the whole country at a very high voltage, taking it literally from one end of Britain to the other. That's the national grid.
Right.
We've got the local connections as well. So it's one interconnected. It allows us to make use of electricity generated in one place, send it across the country, use it in another place, and it gives us security of supply as well. So if the local thing isn't working, you've got a backup somewhere else.
So the national grid is privately owned?
Yes.
And did it get, just remind us, did it get privatised at the same time as the electricity companies and water companies and all that in the 80s and 90s?
Yeah, exactly. 1990, when all that stuff was happening, got put into private hands. But the networks, the national grid and the local networks, although privately owned, they're all quite tightly regulated because they're sort of regarded as a natural monopoly. There's no competition there.
Of course, yeah. So part of that regulation regime, one would have thought, common sense would suggest, has some component about modernising it, making sure it's up to capacity. But that doesn't seem to be the case because it hasn't got the capacity that we need by the sound of it.
Yeah, it hasn't. And that's partly as a result of so the companies would argue, a result of the regulatory regime. The regulator says you companies have got to make a case for why you need to spend the money to upgrade the grid. And if we agree with the case that you make, we'll let you recover the money from the users of the network. And then the case is largely based upon, as you were saying, what other people, generators in particular, say they want from it. But there's also an issue about, part of the reason why you've got this possible 15-year wait is who gets priority order in the queue. So everyone knows that the grid needs upgrading at kind of, bulk scale across the whole country and then more locally. The trigger for actually getting on and doing it largely depends on, as I say, who's got first place in the queue.
Okay, so a part of the National Grid statement is, along the lines of what you just said, is said there are rules, the regulator prevented us from making anticipatory investment in the network ahead of receiving a connection request. So, just to be clear that I understand this, they're saying it's kind of a catch-22 or chicken and egg or cart and horse situation, sort of choose your analogy, where ideally they say they'd want to spend the money to update the network ready for renewable schemes and others to come onto it and start pushing electricity into it, but they're not allowed to spend that money until they get the request, by which time obviously there's then a time lag because they haven't done it.
That's pretty much it. Yeah. Although the regulator would then push back and say, well, you haven't made the argument clearly enough. It's up to you to explain why the anticipatory investment is needed. And yeah, I mean, there's a bit in that, but there's another layer to it as well. So there's the kind of local connection. So you're a renewable developer, you want to build a wind farm or a solar farm or whatever. Yeah, okay, you want to get a connection into your local substation. Then the rest of the network to take the power further away may or may not be ready for it. If that rest of the network needs upgrading, there's a kind of a component of, well, who pays for that upgrade? Is it shared among all of us, or is it the person who's connecting, who's triggering that upgrade? And then the other bit is, if it's a big upgrade, is it regarded as publicly acceptable? Does it get the planning permission to get on and do it? So that's another big bottleneck as well.
So in an ideal world then, say a bottomless amount of money to upgrade the network, what does that involve? I'm uncertain what we're talking about here. Are we talking pylons, or is it digging up stuff that's underground? Is it an unimaginable sum required?
No, it's not unimaginable. There are proposals out there that, relatively detailed plans that talk about, okay, it's billions of pounds of investment in the next sort of 10 to 15 years. it's a lot of money. But by the time you kind of spread it out among all of us, and because of what it enables of getting access to actually increasingly cheap electricity, renewables per unit of energy produced, cheaper than fossil fuels. So it's got a kind of good business case for it, if you like. But it depends on the scale. How big is the thing that's being connected? So locally, it could be digging up, putting solar PV panels on a roof, or let's say of a large warehouse or something. Digging up the streets, low voltage cables. Then the big stuff like offshore wind farms, connecting in. You've got undersea cables, then connecting to the onshore grid, and that needs the cheapest way of doing it. The kind of technically well-established way of doing it is those pylons, the overhead lines. So, building new ones or upgrading the existing ones.
So, the working example I've got in my head is of a hill farmer I spent some time with this year near Dolgellau in North Wales. And he had a brilliant system where they basically caught water from upstream at the top of the mountain on his land, diverted half of it down a pipe a couple of kilometres, so it's travelling at a prodigious speed by the time it hits a turbine which generates electricity which goes into the network. That's been in there since 2014 for my friend Emlyn the farmer. So I asked him, well, why aren't there these in every part of this valley? There's fast flowing streams everywhere down that valley and everywhere else in Wales. So why aren't they all connected? He said, well, it's to do with capacity on the network. So in that instance, say with that valley, what is likely to be the kind of infrastructure spend that's required to bring it up to date?
So, I struggle to sort of envisage exactly the scale of it and how long it would be. But it's, I guess you're talking maybe, millions rather than, certainly millions rather than billions, hundreds of thousands, depending on how long it is, exactly how many want to connect. You're talking, sort of the wood poles with overhead lines at that sort of scale. So it could be, if there's enough of them, then you start to get up to carrying, 100 megawatts or something, and then you're starting to get this steel lattice towers. And you don't need very many of them. It depends, you've got to get access, you've got to get to the site. Mm-hmm. So it's like kind of, it's like kind of your blood system in the body. You've got, the arteries carrying large volumes of blood, then down to the little capillaries, at the extremes. It's a bit like that, really. You've got the little, radial extreme bits of the network with quite low capacity, and then they funnel everything together into kind of the bigger trunk routes, if you like. So you can upgrade them. It's about getting the right level of upgrade at the right place. So it's not inconceivable at all, but they're really unpopular. The moment you want to build the steel lattice tower, nobody likes it. So it's a big challenge to sort of be able to balance off and say, well, okay, it's an eyesore. If you happen to be there, how beautiful is this valley? How much do you want to kind of conserve that? Versus the benefits of getting access to all this beautiful renewable electricity.
So the National Grid has got a point in saying it's not entirely our fault here. There are planning issues. They're saying the number of projects applying to connect to the system has quadrupled in the last 4 years. It can rise even further this year, and so on. But I just can't get past the painful fact that we've got all this potential. Take the example of the water. We got all this potentially free electricity there, but just don't know where to send it because the grid isn't up to date. That does seem barking mad. I know it's not quite that simple, but it's almost that simple, isn't it?
It is almost that simple, and it is pretty barking mad. And one of the kind of barking mad things, I think, is this connection queue. Who gets priority? And National Grid has admitted that a large number, kind of the large-scale stuff that they deal with, rather than the kind of more local stuff that your friend in the North Wales farm would be doing, kind of on the distribution area, but at the transmission, the big scale that National Grid looks after, they've said that the queue doesn't make sense. They talk about zombie projects being in that queue, and the way they've organised it is whoever applies for a connection first gets priority. And it's an order of when you ask, not in order of when you would actually want to connect. So someone could have applied 5 years ago for a connection in 2030, and someone applies today for a connection in 2025. Which one should get priority? And the way it's organised at the moment, with the regulator's approval, I should say, is that the one that applied first, even if they're not, don't need it till 2030, gets priority access to the capacity. And then the one who's applied later has to wait for the upgrade on the assumption that the first one does connect, and then they connect afterwards. And it's just not a rational way of optimising getting the right amount of capacity for the serious projects that are genuine and wanted to connect and get on and develop their projects.
So one would hope that if the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, if it isn't banging heads together and getting this working, then you would hope, they've got a good excuse for why not, because this seems to be absolutely central. They're going to publish a connection action plan this summer, they're saying. What help might that be?
Well, I look forward to seeing it. Yeah, I mean, it's long overdue. But and to be fair, the industry has been talking about this, and the relevant government department, they shuffle the deck chairs around every so often, as you know. They have been trying to bang heads together for years, 10 years, 15 years. Yeah, I mean, I struggle to work out quite why it's so difficult, and I question my own memory. So I've been sort of around the patch in this sort of subject for a few years, and there was a big change to the electricity market trading arrangements at a wholesale level back in about 2005. And something tells me in my mind that they changed the rules then for the connection, for the priority in the connection queue, away from what to me looks more rational. Well, if you want to get on first, then you're higher in the queue than someone who wants to get on later, to this approach that we've got now, of whoever applies first, regardless of your connection date. The trouble with any sort of change is people have got a contract and they will challenge it, possibly in the courts, about their rights being taken away from them. So I think that's one of the reasons why they've just got in this situation that doesn't make any sense.
Okay, do stay with us, please. It's fascinating to talk to you. Let's bring in Gary Williams, who's a farmer in the Black Mountain area of the Brecon Beacons National Park. I don't think I should call it that anymore, should I? But I'll practice the proper Welsh name for it. But Gary, how have you been impacted by this? It's not. I don't think it's not hydro energy with you, is it? It's solar.
Oh, but firstly, thanks a lot for bringing this issue to light, really, because it's. I think, as with everything, Adrian, government sound bites are all great, and net zero, and it all sounds great, but we're practical people, and we've got to look how we can implement this practically on the ground. And as yourself and your expert has said there, with larger scale expansion of the solar system we've got here at the moment, where we pretty much abandoned the idea on the fact that the application for the capacity isn't in the grid to where we live to take that into the system. So as you mentioned, the prolonged waiting period for the application. So I mean, this really needs to be brought to light. It's all very well to talk about net zero. It's all very well to talk about massive expansion of renewables, but at present, Adrian, practically that can't be done.
There's this just logjam, this blockage in the system. So what energy have you got that you can't deliver?
Well, currently we got a relatively small scale 3.9 kilowatt solar system, right? So, I mean, what we're looking at is expanding that solar system. We've got roof capacity here on our farm buildings within the park. We could expand that by 20 times, to be honest with you, Adrian. But ours has been mentioned and brought to light there. We wouldn't get capacity. We'd have to apply for capacity. We may well not get it, and if we did get it, it would be a very, very prolonged waiting period, which would make the business venture non-viable.
So you can't invest on the assumption you'll get it eventually.
Well, on the assumption we'll get it sometime never. So,
I was just wondering, Adrian, Gary, have you been told to pay for an upgrade to the grid?
Well, I mean, I know that. I know a number of farmers in this area have looked at. Firstly, we're in the national park, so nobody's going to get a wind turbine up here, right? Secondly, I know some fellow farmers who've looked at hydro and solar, and the cost of them upgrading would be makes the venture non-viable. So what's happening here now, practically for your listeners and on the ground, we're looking here now more at self-sufficiency of electric in our own businesses, okay? So expanding, we're looking at solar panels, we're looking at backing up the batteries, okay? Now, there has been quite a big question mark about the lifespan of the batteries. How viable is that? Now, we're actually doing quotes at the moment. So we've abandoned, basically, just because of the cost and the weight on upgrading by majorly upgrading to go on the grid. But even to upgrade for our own system, to run the electric on our own farms, and as it happens, we've got a holiday let with 2 jacuzzis, which cost me £550 a month in electricity to run. We've still got to apply for that capacity, even though on the premise that although we're going to use the majority of that, there may be at times in the middle of July where the batteries will be full and there's a sunny day. So even though very little of that electricity will be passed down the grid, we still have to have the capacity to have it available.
So you can't even generate your own electricity for your own good, for your own use.
Well, we can at a relatively small, but we still got to, we've still got to go through the process. Very small, very small scale can be done, but when we with our businesses, we need a decent capacity of electricity, and then we've got to apply for that also. So, it's a major. When you can see our situation, really, not only is it, as I said, I know a lot of farmers have just pretty much abandoned the idea of medium-scale on-farm renewables.
So, just to be clear, you could generate 10 times more than you are at the moment?
Or 20 times more.
Okay, but you can't do it. Well,
so Adrian, I was just going to add there, one of the challenges is the grid has to be the right size for the maximum flow of power, one way or the other. But I think, in Gary's case, I think he's applying to the distribution company, which happened to be taken over, I think, last year by National Grid, although it's a different part of the company. I think they could be much more kind of flexible and accommodating than they sometimes are. In terms of saying, okay, Gary might have to tell them he's putting in a lot of solar PV panels, but to be able to kind of control the grid connection so that it never exceeds a certain level going out or coming in. And then he can make full use of the solar PV and the battery and do all the things he wants to do.
So if Gary's farm was in Bavaria or the foothills of the Pyrenees or something, or the Alps, how would it be different? Have you got any idea how this works or doesn't work in our European neighbours?
I think broadly speaking, it's a similar kind of process, of applying to the local network operator for a connection. You have to tell them what you want to do, make sure it can be accommodated. I don't know if they've got the same kind of queue issues that we've got. And there's another part of it which Gary touched on, which is that, some of his neighbours were sent a bill, right? Okay, we'd have to upgrade. This is another issue about who pays what part of the bill, because you trigger a certain reinforcement of the network, adds a lot of capacity. The person who triggers it, it might be slightly out of date with the rule. But
that's for the national good, isn't it?
Exactly. So why should the person just who triggers it pick up the whole tab and other people can kind of piggyback on it? The rules should be about a way of sharing that bill. And to be fair to the regulator, Ofgem, and the network companies, they continually look at the charging rules. But there's still, I think people would agree, there's still more work to be done there to find, as you say, the fairest way of sharing that out for the national good, and it is all for the national good.
It's really interesting talking to you. Thanks very much. That's Professor Keith Bell, and also Gary Williams joining us from the Black Mountains. Really good to speak to you as well, Gary.